The causes and consequences of World War I. The First World War began in 1914, forever changing the course of history. A war like no other, it shattered empires, redrew borders, and brought forth consequences that would ripple through the 20th century. But what sparked this devastating conflict? And how did its echoes shape our world? Segment 1: The complex causes of World War I. In the years leading up to the war, Europe was a continent on edge. Nationalism surged, with people across empires yearning for self-determination. The great powers, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary, vied for global influence, competing in an imperialist scramble that turned allies into rivals. These nations forged alliances for security, but instead created a web of obligations. Two primary alliances split Europe into two blocks, ensuring that if conflict broke out, it would pull nearly every major power into war. Then, on June 28, 1914, a spark ignited this tinderbox. In Sarajevo, Bosnia, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated by Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian nationalist. What could have been a regional conflict spiraled into war. Austria-Hungary issued Serbia an ultimatum. When Serbia couldn't comply with every demand, Austria declared war. Soon, alliances activated, pulling Germany, Russia, France, and Britain into the fray. By August 1914, Europe was engulfed in war. Segment 2: Consequences on the battlefield. World War I became known as the Great War, with a scale of destruction previously unimaginable. For 4 years, millions of soldiers faced brutal conditions in trenches, fighting over mere yards of land. Machine guns, poison gas, tanks, and airplanes introduced new horrors to warfare. In battles like Verdun and the Somme, hundreds of thousands of lives were lost in months. While the front lines moved little, Europe was left scarred and broken. Segment 3: The cost of war at home. The war's impact was felt far from the battlefields. Entire cities were destroyed, economies crippled, and millions of civilians displaced. Rationing and shortages defined life for those back home, as factories focused on producing weapons and supplies for the front. Women took on roles once reserved for men, working in factories and hospitals, while entire populations endured the daily toll of loss and scarcity. The war transformed society, reshaping lives and expectations. Segment 4: The Treaty of Versailles and New Borders. When the war finally ended in November 1918, Europe lay in ruins. In 1919, leaders of the victorious Allied powers gathered at Versailles to draft a treaty. Their goal was peace, but their terms would sow the seeds of future conflict. The Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to accept full responsibility for the war, pay crushing reparations, and cede territory. Empires collapsed, and new nations emerged across Eastern Europe and the Middle East, as old borders were redrawn. But these new borders often disregarded ethnic and religious groups, creating tensions that would later erupt in conflict. The treaty, intended to secure peace, instead left resentment and economic hardship. Segment 5: Long-term consequences of the war. The war left lasting scars. Germany faced economic ruin and political turmoil, leading to the rise of extremist ideologies. The newly formed League of Nations was created to maintain peace, but lacked the power to prevent further aggression. Millions of soldiers returned home physically and mentally scarred. The psychological impact of shell shock left a generation haunted by trauma, while nations mourned the lives lost. Despite the call that this was the war to end all wars, the unresolved grievances and economic crises laid the groundwork for another, even more devastating conflict. Just 2 decades later, the world would be at war again. The legacy of World War I. World War I was a tragic lesson in the cost of unchecked nationalism, militarism, and complex alliances. Over 16 million lives were lost, entire empires fell, and the global landscape was forever altered. More than a century later, the causes and consequences of World War I remind us of the fragility of peace and the profound impact of war on human lives and history. It stands as a reminder, a warning to future generations.